Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today is going to be the first episode in a potential series about death. Now, the reason why I say potential is I don't really have further episodes planned beyond this, but I anticipate that it's a subject that will come up again just because it's synonymous with living. There's a lot of destruction and a lot of kind of dangerous and difficult things in the world right now. And it is a favorite subject of mine. It's one of those taboo topics that I really wish wasn't so taboo, which leads us into what am I talking about today, which is more from like a clinical provider lens. I'm not saying if you're of the general public, whether you're a consumer of mental health services or you're just interested in the topic, that this somehow won't be a useful or intriguing episode. Just note that how I language and kind of the topics that I'm talking about might be skewed a little bit more towards professionals who are asking these sorts of questions or having these sorts of conversations with their clients or patients. With that in mind, if you have a personal history with suicide and or family members, including completion of suicide, this could be a challenging episode, both because of the content itself and because I might be talking about it in a more intellectual manner, or the emotion or affect of this episode might feel a little bit off kilter. And that's just the nature of how and what it is that we're talking about. So just bear that in mind and be careful if you choose to proceed, because it could be a triggering or challenging episode to listen to. So yeah, just bear that in mind. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, especially given how keyword searches work on the internet, if you're landing here and you're having, thoughts of hurting yourself or suicidal thoughts, do note that there is a shortened, far more accessible suicide and crisis hotline, 988. That's 988. It doesn't matter where in the country you are, what time of day, it will route you to someone who can offer you support. And then, of course, obviously, I would hope, obviously, if you're listening to this and you're on the edge of a life-threatening situation, that would be a call to 911. And as ever, if you're not seeing a provider and you're having thoughts of death or suicide, look for a provider. If you're doing okay right now, but you've been struggling with this for a while, look for someone to talk to. It can be hard sometimes, we'll get into this, to find folks that you feel comfortable talking to about this. But if you do find someone, it can be really important and really helpful because it's a topic that's really hard to encounter and talk to with people in our lives, family, friends, those sorts of things. So consider reaching out for help. So how I'm organizing this episode the best I can, you know me, ad-libbing and not terribly planning well. But first and foremost is what's the mental health field's relationship with death right now, for better or worse. Number two, differentiating between thoughts of death and thoughts of suicide. I've already kind of mentioned these phrases, but they are different. They exist on the same continuum, but they are different constructs. There's a lot of people who don't put in the effort to differentiate these two, which I think is a disservice both to clients and patients and the general public in how we talk about death. It also is a disservice to us as providers and how we communicate with one another about what level of risk the folks we're meeting with might have or exhibit. And number three, talking about death. I can't give like a full how-to. I don't aim to give a full how-to, but I can maybe just kind of float some thoughts out there that might be conducive to anyone who wants to listen. Any other orders of business? Again, I don't think I've said it. I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so if I'm a little bit off today, or if I'm pausing, my apologies, but I'm trying to power through here. So I'm trying to think, anything else? I don't think so. So let's jump into the mental health field's relationship with death. And you're going to hear me use this phrase quite a bit, relationship with death. We all have relationships with death. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we encounter death in our lives. And so just kind of bear that in mind. I'm going to be using that phrase quite a bit. And so the mental health field's relationship with death is mixed. On the plus side, we've gotten way better about assessing for risk. So we really have honed in on asking questions about suicide and inviting people and trying to destigmatize folks who have suicidal thoughts from trying to destigmatize the reaching out for help, that there's not anything inherently wrong with it, but you do need to reach out for help, and we're going to be here waiting for you, wanting to help. And this includes if you know someone who is in trouble or having suicidal thoughts, reaching out on their behalf or trying to get them connected. Those are important things. We also have done a lot of work for refining things called safety plans. These are documents that we collaboratively review with clients and patients and try to help them understand their suicidal thoughts better and ways to mitigate and prevent escalation into acute risk. We even have interventions specifically targeting individuals who have chronic suicidal thoughts. So we've done a lot of work to be far more intentional in this realm. And the side effect is a somewhat of a decrease of stigma around suicide. That's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. However, I think there's this unfortunate irony, and as much, I'll pause and say, I think some people project onto us in the psychological sciences, if you want to call us the psychological science or the art of psychology, of that we're unfettered by the things that we talk to our clients about. We're open and frank with almost any conversation you could possibly think of. And while there's a lot of us providers out there who really have learned to lean into and inhabit challenging conversations, taboo topics, sex, politics, religion, death, we still are subject to the same defenses as everybody else. It's that whole thing of I could be the third eye for others. I'm not always a great third eye for myself. And so our relationship with death is a lot of our providers in the field, I think it's still a complicated relationship. And there's a lot of emotional distance from the relationship. I think what we have done is we've medicalized death. We have created a clinical symptom out of death. So, I just said we all have relationships with death, and yet in this field there's a huge, I think, sect of the population that pushes for it to be a clinical symptom, this thing that is abnormal, that you need to come in and talk to us about, but we want to get rid of. It's a bad thing. It's a problem. Now, I'm not saying it's not a problem if someone's having, pretty serious suicidal thoughts, because my first goal is to pull this person away from that ledge for sure. The proverbial ledge, perhaps the literal ledge, but it is my first course of action. I'm not saying that's not a problem, but we're treating it like a one-trick pony. It's always a problem. If you're encountering death, then you must have some sort of problem. Or in the eyes of a client and patient, the inadvertent consequence of seeing it this way is that there's something inherently wrong with you if you're having thoughts of suicide or thoughts of death, or you're having them with any degree of frequency. And so if we treat it as this inadvertently, this transaction of there's a problem and I'm going to fix your problem and get rid of this problem. And as long as the problem is gone, we can go on to other things. Whereas I think the more important message to send folks is that death is a part of all of us. It's an innate, natural part of us that we have varying degrees of a relationship with. And we can have thoughts of death all the way up to thoughts of suicide. And that's an important thing to learn about and learn from. It is not just a symptom that you eliminate and destroy and hope never comes back again. You want to pull people away from the ledge, yes, but then you want to understand what their relationship is with death. Because if you understand a relationship better, then you know how to navigate that relationship better. You're not just looking out for warning signs. If this looks bad, you shove it away from you and hope it never comes back again. You've got to figure out what your relationship with death is, because it's going to be back. I mean, it could be back 3 decades from now. I can't tell you. It could be back 3 weeks from now. I'm not 100% sure. But it behooves us to normalize and learn about our relationships with death so that we feel more equipped and we're more objective and observant about what is it that provokes or triggers or pulls us towards the death instinct, as we call it. So this might not seem like a big deal, or perhaps it's already intuitive to you, but to me it's a huge deal. It's a subtle but important difference between seeing death as a problem versus seeing death as something natural inside of us that needs to be understood. Now remember, I'm not saying that you don't need to do important work to pull people away from acute risk, but once they're away from risk, It, to me, is far more economical, far more humanizing, far more destigmatizing to see it as something that exists in all of us rather than a clinical syndrome, problem, symptom that needs to be eliminated. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. So let's differentiate, go to topic number 2, the differences between thoughts of death and thoughts of suicide. And hopefully this will kind of illustrate what I'm trying to say here, why we need a more flexible and open relationship with death as a field. One, while some providers understand the difference between these two constructs, thoughts of death versus thoughts of suicide, there's lots that just clump it all together in the realm of suicide, or in our documentation, SI, suicidal ideation. And it's doing everybody a huge disservice. Because thoughts of death represent a huge array of experiences that tons, I guarantee you, millions of people have experienced in their lifespan before we even get to suicidal thoughts. So let's walk through these. Remember, death is a part of living. That is part of our lives. We are going to encounter death one way or another, whether we like it or not, and we need to learn how to encounter it better. There are cultures in this world that have learned to celebrate and embrace death in a way that is conducive for understanding it better rather than fearing it and running from it. And so, whether it's something that happens to us or something that we drive ourselves to, it is within reason that after these things occur, we will grapple with existence and meaning, and thereby, should I be here? So, examples can be chronic illnesses, terminal illnesses, one that isn't, killing somebody right away, but that an end is in sight. It could be traumas of any kind, wartime, or some sort of major violation of self. It can be, breakups. It could be loss of job. It could be loss of partners. It could be deaths in the family. It could be all sorts of things that have someone pause and say, I don't know how to move forward. I don't know if I should move forward. Or for some folks, it's like, I don't know why I'm still here. I don't know why I made it and someone else didn't. And these are the lower key thoughts of death, but they're important ones because there's this grappling with why? What is this about? And we got to be able to talk to folks about this stuff because, as I alluded to earlier, it's hard to find places, safe people to talk about these thoughts with and these feelings with. And then as we go up kind of severity level, not just questioning existence and the ability to move on or the willingness to move on, there's the questioning of whether or not they want to be alive at all. Excuse me. And in this case, it's I'm not going to do anything about it. It lacks that sort of volition is the word I use. You ask them about it, are you having thoughts of suicide? No, I'm not going to do anything about it. But world swallow me whole. If I didn't wake up tomorrow, if I was hit by a bus tomorrow, if I was struck by lightning tomorrow, so be it. Good. Then I wouldn't have to deal with X, Y, or Z. And that's really a place of kind of grieving existence, this sort of uncertainty, this lack of commitment. It can even represent kind of not status quo, but an autopilot mode of operating. You got one foot in the land of the living and one foot in the land of the dead. And it's a precarious way to operate, even if they're not acute risk. That's important to talk to folks about. Now, there is a line in the sand, right? It's getting real close. All it takes is that little bit of a lean that says, you know what? These thoughts of death I'm having, I could do something about it. Boom, that's when you start hitting into suicidal ideation because you're thinking about the act of suicide. Excuse me. And it's an important distinction. Now, I'm still assessing people, especially if I don't know their relationship with death on the front end. If they're like, I'm having thoughts of death, and they quantify it as thoughts of death after I make illuminate the difference, I still double check, any history of suicidal thoughts, any history of attempts, just making sure I understand in general at the front end their relationship with death. But suicidal ideation comes in the fray, you really got to be doing that because it's actively there. This sort of energy that could turn to action is there, and so you really got to be on top of it more so than someone who's just saying, "No, I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not sure about my purpose or my reason for existing." And this is where, if you're a provider, ideally you've been trained on this to some degree, So those are kind of list off as reminders. This is not going to be all encompassing. But, recall it's this sort of like, well, do you have any plans? Do you have any intent? Do you have any means? What's the frequency, the duration? One I really like to ask, the sense of urgency around these thoughts. And you're just assessing to be like, where exactly are we at? Because much like thoughts of death has a huge range, so do thoughts of suicide. I'll give you an example. Someone who's never had suicidal thoughts before, the first time it comes up is really interesting because in some ways there's high risk there because we don't know. There's no precedent for how they move through these thoughts of suicide. Yet at the same time, you will often get kind of a fresher, exploration of something that's very new, and they might not be terribly high risk because it's new and alarming to them, and they back off of it very quickly. They're like, oh gosh, I don't want to have these thoughts. Oh, I don't know where this is coming from. And that's good to know. It's very different than someone who's had chronic suicidal thoughts. But even within chronicity, there could be people who just fleetingly, momentarily, I have thoughts of suicide. It feels like a bad habit for me. Like anytime something goes wrong, I think of it. And so I'm not going to do anything about it. But it's just frustrating because it's always there versus it's chronically there. It's severe. It's acute. There's question of intent. Those are, again, very different things. Think about means. Some people will never get to that point, but tons of folks, if they have thought about suicide, especially if they thought about it more than a few times in their life, they probably have a list of potential means. Like, we all know this stuff. You, as a viewer, if you've never thought of suicide before, I'm sure you could think of methods like that. Of course, these folks have possible means, and thereby, yeah, I've thought about I could do this. I could go and grab this particular pill bottle. And that doesn't constitute a hard and fast plan, but it constitutes like this really loose version of having some means and a quasi plan in place. But once again, that's very different than someone who's methodically planned a method. All it takes is enactment, or if they have researched methodologies and specific doses and all this other stuff. Those are very different types of ideation. So hopefully you're picking up what I'm putting down is that both constructs, thoughts of death and thoughts of suicide, beg of deeper exploration. But the field in general is better at the suicide stuff than it is the death stuff. And I think because the death stuff is more amorphous, there's less to do with it. There's less like A, B, C, D that we got to walk through as providers. And it gets people nervous if they're uncomfortable talking about death. And that's what we got to get better at doing, is talking about it, but also delineating between these two so that we're not labeling people as having suicidal thoughts when in reality they're just having thoughts of death. And heaven forbid that we equip our clients with this language too. When I'm meeting with folks, they once I give them this information, they're very appreciative because they know how to differentiate between the two with me. It's like, no, it's just the thoughts of death stuff coming up. Oh, okay, we've talked about that. I know how to shift into this. Let's talk more existentially, curiously. Oh, wait, this time it's a shift into suicidal thoughts. Ooh, something worse is coming up. And they usually alert to that too and go, yeah, that is weird. Normally I'm in the thoughts of death land. Now I'm having suicidal thoughts. I want to tell you right away because I understand that we understand. That's a more serious thing for me. And so we need to be a little bit more intentional over here. So all around, I think it's just a good thing to consider how we talk to one another, myself and patients, but also myself and other providers, and how you might be talking to your clients and patients as well. All right, so that's the second one. Number 3 is how do we talk about it? I've kind of mentioned this throughout the other pieces here. Just to kind of recap or quasi recap. There is on the front end delineating between these two. And the easiest way, it's just a gift to providers, is disclosure statements. Whether you work for an agency or you're working for yourself, you go through a disclosure statement, or you at least give people disclosure statements. And the big piece of these disclosure statements, it's not all of it, but a big piece is confidentiality and limits therein. And one of the limits of confidentiality is harm to yourself. And so it's a perfect time to talk about that line in the sand of imminent risk when we would breach confidentiality and those times that we would not. We want you to feel open and we want clients and patients to trust us to convey that they're having thoughts of death or thoughts of suicide, and not be concerned that we're going to overreact and hospitalize them right away, even if there's no acute or immediate risk. This is a perfect opportunity to specifically say, end thoughts of death, because it really runs the gamut. It could be just not wanting to live anymore, and I absolutely want to talk to you about that, because that's interesting if that comes up for you once, or if it comes up for you multiple times, and then all the way up to suicidal thoughts, which you're probably more familiar with. And they can ask questions of like, wait, what's the difference between the two? But if they don't have questions, go, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for opening the door. They often never say thank you, but you've opened the door and said like, I want to talk to you about your relationship with death. Because if death is in the room, it's going to be interfering with our work to some degree. Even if you're not going to do anything about it, I want you to feel safe talking to me about this stuff. They'll say, okay, in worst case, you planted seeds that if it ever comes up, you've got that right there waiting for them. Remember when we talked about it. You still might need reminders. The first time death comes up, you do have to do this more robust assessment, which I was talking about. Like I consider it like not just a singular solitary symptom, but it's like, okay, here's death. Here's this part of self, this self state that we all have. And I'm going to explore it because the minute it comes up, I need to understand this person's relationship with it so that I understand and we can have a common language for when it's really like, oh no, that's a problem. Or like, no, we've been here before. And we can have a different type of conversation around it. And this is where you have to have lines in the sand for when you safety plan and when you don't. But usually clients have found it very helpful when I delineate between these two because it gives them a lot more permission to be in the realm of thoughts of death without being worried that they're going to have all this serious conversation and safety planning just because they might have had some thoughts of death. But it's a perfect opportunity to explore. And I will say, hey, I'm going to ask you some questions. And if they've been in treatment before, I'll sometimes say, like, I don't know how people have asked or talked to you about this before. There are going to be some concrete, things I do need to know. But I also still, like we had talked about, I want to understand just your history with it in general. What makes you tick when it comes to, your relationship with death. And most folks have been very appreciative of that, especially the relationship with death piece. They'll often reflect, like, no one's really ever said it to me that way. Like, it's always this bad thing, this thing that I have to get rid of, but I'm allowed to have a relationship with death. I'm like, yeah, you are. And so it's been quite helpful. Once I get a better understanding, what I'll often use is some sort of imagery or metaphor, and this might be helpful for you, I'm not sure. But the way I say it is, look, now pause. Remember, I'm a psychodynamic clinician by trade, so you might not have this in your lexicon or how you conceptualize people, so just kind of bear that in mind. You might be able to borrow indirectly here, but I'll often say, like, look, we've been exploring various parts of you, various self states. Internal family systems uses parts, language, psychodynamic uses like self states, etc., etc. We've explored these parts of you. And, we've talked about how we have to learn our relationships with these different parts of self because they all need to be working together so that we're being more intentional in the present day. And death is a part of us too. So imagine that we're in this room together and we've got these various parts of self. And ideally, they're all in the same room because, for some folks, if one's running away or another one's living in the attic or down in the basement, they ain't talking to each other terribly well. So we're trying to get them together and all socializing. Well, guess what? Death is in the room with us too. It always is. Now, ideally, our relationship with death, not that we like to exclude people socially, but death is not necessarily the life of the party. We don't want it to be the life of the party. It's in the room. We talk to it every once in a while. It comes to us. We come to it every once in a while. It's cool, but it's not our best friend. It's not the part of self that we want to be ruling the roost or really right next to you, sitting down in the chair always. It's your best bud. We don't want it to be that type of relationship. So if death is right here or right here whispering in your ear, or you are constantly coming to death and saying, hey, what's that scythe about? Like, hey, do you want to go on a boat trip down the River Styx together? Like, that's a problem. We don't want it that close. And so you and I are going to have to talk about, like, if it's that close, how do we gain some distance from it? Not because we want to eliminate it or kill it or kick it out the house or anything like that, because that's not how that works. But we need some distance so that we can understand what our relationship with death is. So we understand how to interact with it more fruitfully. Because while death is very scary, it's usually telling us something very important about our lives. Something existentially is not quite going right if death is hanging around too close or too frequently with us. And so once we get that distance, we can be more objective and understand it. But once it gets real close, we have to talk about like, whoa. How do we pause and say, no, we can't just like let death dictate right now. Let's get some distance between us and it. And folks have found that helpful because they'll sometimes reflect back to me like, yeah, it's not like super close. It's just it's out there. It's not intruding, but it is. I am hearing it. It is giving me some grief and some trouble, and so I'm bringing it up to you because that's what we talked about. And I go, thank you very much. Whereas other times people say like, ooh, it's like right in my ear again, and it's not good. Like, okay. And that way you're not just talking through like the clinical terminology, you can talk through the metaphor or use the imagery to talk about like, where is it at right now? Where are you at right now in this conversation with death? Trying to think, I mean, outside of that, I think I peppered it in there. I talk a lot about, this idea of a relationship, that a relationship evolves over time. And so this is probably the final point I'll make is our relationship with love. Take for instance, this one's accessible to everybody. You can look back to when you were first in love, or infatuated at least, or attracted to somebody. You can look back at your first loves if you had them, or your first heartbreaks if you had them, or maybe you're perplexed because you haven't quite figured out what love is. But you can track this back. That each sequential experience around the topic of love is going to change your relationship with it, for better or worse. Our relationship with anger, our relationship with aggression. Now, some folks, when we talk about the death instinct, say aggression and self-destruction are part and parcel to the death instinct, but that's perhaps a different episode. I don't want to get too complicated here. And so our relationship with death is identical. You talk to someone who had family members die when they were younger. Even if they're not having thoughts of death or thoughts of suicide, they have a different relationship with death. When you have someone who goes into the military and is around death during wartime, their relationship with death fundamentally changes. When you talk to someone who has never had thoughts of death or thoughts of suicide till they're 30, it's very different than someone who's chronically had them or recurrently had them since they were in their teens. That's kind of my story, is thinking about death and existence, very existentially driven from a young age, and continued on and had thoughts of suicide and stuff like that periodically throughout my life. Still struggle with thoughts of death sometimes to this day. And it's just this fascinating part of me that I've had to learn, like, why do I have this interesting relationship with death? I have to understand what this is so that when it comes up, it doesn't consume me. I can understand it better, even if I'm still, I still have to work on it and go like, why are you back? Okay, all right, what can I learn here? I have to look back at my history, that has been an evolving relationship. And if I don't look back, it's really hard for me to fruitfully engage it in the present day, because I'm just seeing it as a problem right in front of me right now, rather than something that has context and history to it. And so the more we talk to our clients and patients about it in that light, or the more your providers maybe give you that opportunity to talk about it, or you talk about it through that light, the better off I think that we are, because then we understand the narrative, and we understand narratives, we then know where the narrative might head, or how we might be able to tackle the narrative moving forward. So I think that'll do it. The long and the short of it here is, first, the relationship our field, the mental health field, has with death is kind of complicated. We've done a lot of good work, but we still have our own fears and anxieties around death that deter us from having open, frank, and very human conversations with people about death. It is not helped by a lack of differentiation between thoughts of death and suicide, because suicide holds certain valence or energy that is alarming to a lot of folks, as it should be. But when we expand and create kind of a continuum of death, I think it makes it a lot more accessible, both for clients and patients and us as providers. And last but not least, I hope my conversation around like how you might talk about it or imagery and metaphor that might be useful, as well as seeing it from a developmental part of self-state lens, again, hopefully it was helpful to some degree to hear, even if it is not meant to be exhaustive or a how-to, so to speak. So I think I'll end it there. I just appreciate your attention and am willing to sit through a challenging and sometimes charged topic. We'll see if I can create some more episodes moving forward. But for now, we'll end it there. And as always, stay curious.